August 15, 1945. Manila, Philippine Islands. The air hung thick and motionless over Santo Tomas internment camp, carrying with it the acrid smell of cooking fires and unwashed bodies pressed together in tropical heat. In the women's barracks, a skeletal figure named Margaret Schwerk lay on a bamboo mat, her eyes tracing the patterns of rust bleeding through the corrugated tin roof above. For 3 years, 8 months, and 23 days, she had counted every sunrise through these walls. The only sounds that punctuated the oppressive silence were the rhythmic click of guard boots on gravel, the distant cough of dysentery from the next shanty, and the low murmur of women reciting remembered recipes to keep their minds from the gnawing emptiness in their bellies. Then, without warning, a crackling hiss pierced the stillness. The camp loudspeakers, silent for so long they had become invisible fixtures of despair, suddenly erupted with sound. Not Japanese commands. Not propaganda broadcasts. But something impossible. Something forgotten. The opening brass flourish of Duke Ellington's Take the A Train. Margaret's body went rigid. Around her, women froze mid-motion, tin cups suspended in air, needle and thread forgotten in trembling fingers. The music poured through the camp like water breaking through a dam, cascading over the rows of makeshift shelters, flooding the consciousness of 1,500 women who had been imprisoned since the first days of war. Some collapsed where they stood. Others clutched at their neighbors, mouths open in silent gasps. Tears carved clean lines through the grime on weathered faces. Because that sound, that impossible, beautiful, swinging American sound, meant only one thing. Liberation had come. But this moment, this breaking point between captivity and freedom, between silence and song, between death and resurrection, was not simply about the end of suffering. It was the collision of two worlds, two ideologies, two visions of what humanity could be. For these women, and for thousands like them across the Pacific Theater, the experience of American liberation would prove more devastating to Japanese imperial mythology than any battlefield defeat. What broke through those camp speakers was not merely entertainment. It was the sound of a civilization the Japanese militarists had promised did not exist, could not exist. A civilization built not on rigid hierarchy and sacrifice, but on improvisation, abundance, and the radical notion that individual expression mattered. The jazz that made these women weep was the audible proof that everything their captors had told them was a lie. When Japan's military planners conceived the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere in 1940, they sold their vision on a simple premise. Asia would be liberated from Western colonial exploitation and united under Japanese guidance into a harmonious, self-sufficient bloc. The propaganda was sophisticated, appealing to genuine anti-colonial sentiment across the region. Japanese radio broadcasts proclaimed that Americans and Europeans had grown soft, morally corrupt, obsessed with material excess while their societies crumbled from within. The United States, they insisted, was a paper tiger, a mongrel nation of jazz-playing degenerates who lacked the spiritual purity and warrior discipline to sustain a long Pacific war. This narrative required the complete isolation of conquered populations from any contradictory evidence. In December 1941, when Japanese forces swept through the Philippines, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies, they rounded up not just military personnel but civilian nationals of enemy powers. Teachers, nurses, missionaries, businesswomen, the wives and daughters of colonial administrators. Thousands of Western women found themselves herded into internment camps across the Japanese Empire. Santo Tomas University in Manila became one such facility, its academic halls transformed into a sprawling prison city holding over 4,000 internees at its peak. The Japanese administrators made deliberate choices about what information penetrated these walls. Newspapers were prohibited. Letters from home were censored into meaninglessness or simply destroyed. Radio access was punishable by death. The internees existed in a carefully constructed information void, fed only the narrative their captors permitted. As the war ground through 1942, 1943, and into 1944, conditions deteriorated steadily. Food rations, never adequate, dwindled to starvation levels. Medical supplies evaporated. Women who had arrived in their Sunday dresses and sensible shoes found themselves in rags, their bodies wasting to skeletal frames, their teeth loosening from scurvy, their minds fogging from protein deficiency. The Japanese commandants assured them this suffering was universal, that America was losing the war, that the homeland had forgotten them, that they should be grateful for Japanese mercy in allowing them to live at all. Some internees began to believe it. When months passed without rescue, without even accurate news, the propaganda seeped in through the cracks of hope. Perhaps America truly was weak. Perhaps the war was already lost. Perhaps this camp would be their grave. But these women, despite their circumstances, maintained small acts of resistance that revealed the fundamental misunderstanding at the heart of Japanese ideology. They organized classes, teaching children from memory the history and literature they could no longer access in books. They formed orchestras with improvised instruments, creating music from salvaged wire and hollowed wood. They held elections for camp committees, debating and voting on the distribution of resources with a democratic seriousness that baffled their captors. Even in starvation, even under the constant threat of violence, they insisted on governance by consensus rather than submission to pure authority. They could not have articulated it then, but they were living proof that the values they came from, the messy, argumentative, individualistic culture of democratic society, could survive conditions designed to crush them. On the morning of August 15, 1945, the war ended in a way few of the Santo Tomas internees could have imagined. After the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast crackled across Japan's empire. But the women in Manila did not hear that broadcast. They learned of their liberation through music. American forces, having recaptured Manila in brutal urban combat months earlier, had been preparing for this moment. They knew these camps existed throughout the city. They knew that thousands of their countrymen and women had been trapped in a psychological prison as much as a physical one. And they understood, with the strategic wisdom that characterized America's approach to the war's final phase, that liberation was not just about opening gates. It was about restoring hope, about reintegrating the traumatized into the world they had been severed from. The decision to broadcast jazz was not random. Military psychological officers had studied the effects of prolonged captivity, understood that prisoners needed not just food and medicine but cultural reconnect ion, proof that the civilization they remembered still existed and had, in fact, prevailed. Jazz was chosen deliberately because it was quintessentially, undeniably American. You could not fake jazz. You could not imitate its particular alchemy of African-American innovation, European harmony, and raw democratic spirit. It was music that demanded improvisation, that celebrated individual virtuosity within collective creation, that swung with an optimism Japanese military marches could never approximate. It was the sound of a nation the Japanese propaganda machine insisted was spiritually hollow, culturally inferior, and militarily defeated. And when it poured through those camp speakers, it demolished 3 years of carefully constructed lies in 32 bars. Margaret Shirk, who would later write extensively about her internment experience, described those first moments of hearing American music as more overwhelming than any purely factual announcement could have been. We had been told so often that America had abandoned us, that the homeland was losing, that our families had moved on without us, she recalled. We had tried not to believe it, but starvation makes you vulnerable to despair. Then that music came through, that impossible, joyful, complex music, and we knew instantly. Not because someone told us in words, but because we could hear in every note that America was strong, was confident, was the same country we had left. Jazz doesn't lie. You can't play like that if you're defeated. The women's reactions were raw and uncontrolled. British internee Isla Caulfield wrote in her diary that evening, "When the brass section came in, I saw a woman named Dorothy collapse to her knees, her hands pressed to her face, sobbing with such violence I thought she might break. But she was smiling. We were all smiling and weeping simultaneously, making sounds I cannot describe with any dignity. The Japanese guards stared at us as if we had gone mad. Perhaps we had. Perhaps sanity was impossible until that moment when we heard proof that the world we came from still existed." The music continued for hours. Swing orchestras, big band arrangements, the unmistakable rhythms of American optimism and industrial might. For women who had been surviving on 200 calories a day, who had watched friends die of beriberi and malaria, who had endured interrogations and random cruelties, the message was clear. While they had been imprisoned in enforced silence, America had been building, creating, swinging. The nation had not only survived but had generated such surplus energy that it could package joy into musical form and broadcast it across the Pacific as casually as a weapon. This was abundance as warfare. This was culture as proof of victory. What these female prisoners experienced in that August afternoon was a collision between two fundamentally incompatible worldviews. The Japanese military ideology of the 1930s and 1940s was built on the concept of virtuous scarcity. A warrior nation, they believed, was forged through discipline, sacrifice, and the suppression of individual desire for collective survival. The Japanese soldier was taught to endure on minimal rations, to consider death preferable to surrender, to view material comfort as spiritual weakness. This philosophy extended to civilian governance in occupied territories. Resources were extracted to feed the imperial war machine while local populations were lectured on the spiritual benefits of doing without. The co-prosperity sphere, in practice, meant organized hunger justified by ideological purity. American military culture, by contrast, operated on a philosophy of logistics as moral statement. The United States did not simply feed its soldiers adequately, it fed them lavishly. The standard daily ration for an American serviceman in the Pacific Theater included over 4,000 calories, meat at multiple meals, fresh vegetables when possible, candy bars, chewing gum, and cigarettes. This was not merely about nutrition. It was a declaration of values. A democracy that sent its citizens to war owed them not just the tools to fight but the dignity of abundance. American commanders understood that morale was a weapon, that well-fed soldiers fought better, thought more clearly, and embodied the civilization they were defending. The supplies that followed American forces across the Pacific, the mountains of canned goods and medical supplies and entertainment resources, represented an industrial capacity that Japanese planners had catastrophically underestimated. When American forces liberated internment camps, they did not simply open the gates and move on. They arrived with supply convoys that seemed, to the starving prisoners, like visions from a fever dream. Crates of spam and corned beef, powdered milk and eggs, chocolate bars and fresh bread. Medical supplies in quantities that suggested those who sent them had not needed to choose between treating soldiers and treating civilians. They had simply produced enough for both. One nurse at Santo Tomas, Dorothy Still Danner, later wrote, "The American soldiers who entered our camp looked healthy. Not just adequately fed, but healthy, muscular, energetic. They moved with a casualness about physical well-being that was almost obscene to us, who had been dying by inches. But more than their health, it was their attitude. They were cheerful. They made jokes. They distributed candy to the children as if candy were infinite. For 3 years, we had been taught that America was weak, was starving, was on the verge of collapse. These young men, with their easy confidence and their trucks full of supplies, were living contradictions to everything we had been told." The female internees, many of whom had been teachers, nurses, and missionaries before the war, possessed the intellectual framework to understand what they were witnessing. This was not just about having more food than Japan. This was about a fundamentally different relationship between a government and its people. The Japanese militarists demanded sacrifice without explanation, obedience without reciprocity. The American system, for all its flaws and contradictions, operated on an implied contract. A democracy must care for its citizens, must demonstrate that their sacrifices serve a larger flourishing, must prove through material reality that freedom produces superior outcomes to tyranny. The abundance that American forces brought to these camps was not accidental. It was the physical manifestation of a political philosophy. In the days and weeks following liberation, as military doctors and nutritionists worked to safely reintroduce food to bodies on the edge of starvation, the women of Santo Tomas underwent a psychological transformation as profound as their physical recovery. They had entered the camp as citizens of a nation they understood intellectually. They emerged as witnesses to something more fundamental. The jazz that announced their liberation became a recurring presence in their testimonies, their letters home, their later memoirs. It represented a specific kind of cultural confidence that fascism could not replicate. One internee, a former music teacher named Ethel Herold, spent her first days of freedom listening obsessively to armed forces radio broadcasts. She wrote to her sister in Ohio, "I am trying to explain to you what it means to hear American music after years of silence. It's not nostalgia, though that is part of it. It's hearing the sound of a society that can afford complexity. Jazz is complicated, darling. It requires education, leisure time for practice, resources for instruments, cultural space for experimentation. It requires a society wealthy enough that some people can be professional musicians rather than everyone being forced into pure survival labor. When I hear Benny Goodman's clarinet, I am hearing proof that while we were starving, America was so secure it could support entire orchestras. Do you understand? Their propaganda told us America was weak, was falling apart. But you cannot fake that music. You cannot create jazz in a nation that is dying." This realization rippled through the internee population, particularly among those who had begun to doubt, who had let Japanese propaganda erode their certainty. They had survived through faith that rescue would come, but faith tested by starvation becomes fragile. The material reality of liberation, the staggering abundance of American supply lines, the casual competence of their liberators, rebuilt that faith on concrete foundation. They had seen both systems now, the Japanese ideology of sacrifice without reward, and the American reality of prosperity that could project power across an ocean while still maintaining cultural vitality at home. The comparison was devastating to any lingering notion that fascist discipline was somehow more effective than democratic chaos. The symbolic power of jazz continued to resonate because it represented something the female internees had intuitively understood but could now articulate clearly. Democracy was not just about voting and laws. It was about trusting people to make decisions, to improvise, to create without centralized control. Jazz was the musical equivalent of democratic governance, structured enough to function, loose enough to breathe, dependent on each musician being skilled enough to both support others and take their moment in the spotlight. It was everything Japanese militarism was not. Where Japanese military culture demanded rigid obedience and suppression of individual expression, jazz celebrated the individual voice within collective effort. Where Japanese propaganda insisted that discipline required poverty and suffering, jazz emerged from a nation wealthy enough to let people play. Santo Tomas was not unique. Across the Pacific Theater, in camps from the Philippines to Java to Manchuria, the pattern repeated with variations. Female internees, cut off from accurate information, subjected to propaganda and privation, maintained their cultural identity through memory and stubborn insistence on democratic process. And when American forces arrived, the liberators brought not just military efficiency but cultural proof. The supplies, the medicine, the casual abundance, the music. Each element reinforced the same message. You were not abandoned, your civilization not only survived but flourished, and the ideology that imprisoned you was based on fundamental lies about human nature and political economy. In Singapore, when British and Australian women held at Changi prison were liberated, they encountered American supply officers who seemed genuinely confused by the camp's deprivation. But why didn't they feed you? One young lieutenant asked, as if the idea of deliberately starving prisoners was incomprehensible to him. He represented a military culture that, whatever its other failings, considered adequate provision a basic competence, not an extravagance. In the Dutch East Indies, where Indonesian camps held European women and children in particularly brutal conditions, the arrival of American aid packages seemed almost surreal. Chocolate bars, powdered milk, canned fruit. Items the internees had not merely been denied but had been told no longer existed anywhere in the world. The lie of universal scarcity collapsed before the evidence of American plenty. The female experience of liberation carried particular weight because these women had been targeted specifically as symbols. Japanese propaganda had made much of liberating Asia from European colonial dominance, and the humiliation of Western women was part of that narrative. By reducing them to starvation, by forcing them into rags, by demonstrating their powerlessness, the Japanese administration sought to prove that Western civilization offered no protection, no superior values, no reason for Asian populations to prefer it. But the women themselves refused that narrative. They maintained schools, held elections, organized democratic governance even in captivity. And when liberation came, when they encountered the full force of American logistical might and cultural confidence, they became living testimonies to the failure of fascist ideology. Jazz, in this context, operated on multiple levels simultaneously. It was entertainment, certainly, but it was also evidence, argument, and prophecy. The women who wept at hearing it were not responding only to nostalgia, though that was present. They were responding to the cognitive dissonance of hearing something their captors had insisted could not exist. Japanese propaganda had painted America as a nation in terminal decline, its mixed-race population incapable of real culture, its democracy a weakness that would collapse under pressure. Jazz contradicted every element of that narrative. It was sophisticated music created by black Americans, performed by mixed orchestras, distributed by a government confident enough to make cultural outreach part of its military strategy. It swung with an optimism that was psychologically impossible for a defeated nation. The recurring presence of music in liberation narratives was not coincidental. American military planners understood psychological warfare in ways that complemented traditional combat. They knew that breaking the enemies will require not just battlefield victory but the destruction of enemy mythology. The Japanese had promised their subjects and prisoners that American decadence would be their downfall. When American forces arrived not decadent but disciplined, not weakened but overwhelmingly strong, not culturally barren but carrying orchestras and film projectors and libraries, the ideological foundation of Japanese resistance crumbled. The women in those camps became witnesses to this collapse, and many of them processed it through the lens of sound. Sister Rufina, a Catholic nun who survived 3 years in Los Baños camp south of Manila, wrote in her Orders Chronicles, "We heard the guns first, the American artillery that meant the fighting was close. Then we heard the voices, young men shouting in American English. Then, God help me, we heard them singing. As they secured the camp, these soldiers were singing jazz tunes and radio hits. They sounded so young, so confident, so utterly unbroken by war. I realized then that we had survived. Yes, but more than that, the civilization we came from had survived intact. Not damaged, not diminished, but strong enough that its soldiers sang while they worked. The Japanese had tried to teach us that democracy was weak, that only their Bushido discipline could prevail. Those singing soldiers were the answer. Democracy had sent them well-fed, well-armed, and so certain of victory they could sing about it." In the aftermath of liberation, as the female internees were processed through military hospitals, fed carefully calibrated diets to avoid refeeding syndrome, examined and documented and slowly reintegrated into the world beyond barbed wire, they carried with them a knowledge that would shape the rest of their lives. They had seen both visions of human organization, the fascist model of scarcity, discipline, and hierarchy, and the democratic model of abundance, improvisation, and individual dignity. They had lived under both systems in their most extreme forms, and they could testify with authority about which one actually worked. Many of these women spent their post-war years teaching, writing, speaking about their experiences. They became unexpected ambassadors for a particular understanding of what the war had been about. It was not just about territory or revenge or even the obvious moral necessity of stopping genocide. It was about proving which system, which ideology, which relationship between government and governed could actually deliver human flourishing. The Japanese militarists had promised that sacrifice would bring glory, that discipline would bring victory, that submission to authority would create a harmonious co-prosperity sphere. Instead, it had brought starvation, defeat, and the humiliation of watching their carefully constructed information bubble popped by the sound of Duke Ellington's orchestra. The jazz that made these women weep became, in their testimonies and memories, a symbol of something more profound than music. It represented the sound of a civilization that could walk and chew gum simultaneously, that could wage industrial warfare while maintaining cultural creativity, that could project power across an ocean while still swinging with optimism. It was the sound of abundance as ideology, the audible proof that democracy, for all its messiness and contradictions, actually worked better than the alternatives. It was the sound of freedom not as an abstract concept but as a lived reality, as material as the food in those supply crates, as concrete as the medicine that saved lives, as undeniable as the healthy faces of the soldiers who opened the gates. Margaret Shirk, who survived Santo Thomas and lived to write multiple accounts of her experience, returned again and again to that moment when the music started. In her final memoir, published when she was in her 80s, she wrote, "People ask me what liberation felt like. They expect me to talk about the food, the medicine, the end of fear. And yes, all of that mattered. But what I remember most clearly, what still makes me weep even now, was hearing that jazz. Because in that moment, I knew. I knew the America I remembered was real. I knew that everything they told us about our nation being weak and defeated was a lie. I knew that we had not been forgotten, that the values we came from had prevailed. You cannot fake that music. You cannot create it in a dying civilization. That jazz was the sound of abundance, of confidence, of a democracy that was so strong it could afford to let people improvise. It was the sound of home, not just as a place but as an idea. And we wept because we understood, without needing anyone to explain, that we had won. Not just survived, but won. The women who heard jazz over those camp loudspeakers carried that moment with them as sacred memory. It became the punctuation mark on years of suffering, the proof that endurance had meaning, the evidence that they had been right to keep faith when faith seemed foolish. In the decades that followed, as America grappled with its own contradictions and failures, as the simplistic narratives of World War II gave way to more complex understandings, these women remained steadfast in one truth. They had seen what happened when freedom confronted tyranny, when abundance met scarcity, when the messy democracy of jazz met the rigid discipline of military march. And jazz had won. Not because it was more militarily effective, though it came from a nation that proved devastatingly effective at war, but because it represented a way of organizing human society that actually delivered on its promises. It promised dignity and provided abundance. It promised freedom and generated creativity. It promised that individuals mattered, and then proved it by letting everyone improvise. That is what made them weep. Not relief, though that was present. Not joy, though that was overwhelming. But the crushing realization that they had been right all along. That the civilization they came from, with all its imperfections, was worth defending. That the ideology that imprisoned them was built on lies that could not survive contact with reality. That the sound of freedom, when it finally came, would be unmistakable. Would be undeniable. Would be jazz.